interesting that healing people, healing blind people seem to be a common occurrence. And actually, the healing of the blind occurred with the greatest frequency amongst all the different kind of miracles that are given to us, that are recorded for us. And so is here the case. Here is a man who was born blind. Well, I think it is not only a physical healing of physical blindness, but behind that healing of physical blindness, I think there's an important spiritual lesson as well. And that is that while people might be physically able to see, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, that the God of this world has blinded their eyes, their spiritual eyes, that they cannot see the glory of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so a person has a spiritual eye as well, as Paul says, and that eye can be blinded by Satan, by the evil one, by the god of this world. And so Jesus comes to open the spiritual eyes of people, not only the physical eyes in this case, in this miracle, but also the spiritual eyes of people. And so that is an important part of the message of salvation. It's interesting just to note quickly that if we were to look at the New Testament, there were two examples of people who were born with a disability. Here in John chapter 9, a person was born blind. Well, if you're familiar with Acts chapter 3, you'll know that when John and Peter went to the temple to pray, they came across a person who was what? He was lame. He was born handicapped. He was born unable to walk from he was born thus. And, sorry, we lost our... and I think those two pictures are very, very significant for us. But just quickly coming back to this, a work of salvation. Well, certainly it also is a work of transformation. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday evening, if you were here with us. In terms of the gospel is not only a gospel of salvation, the gospel is a gospel of transformation. And certainly in this case, we saw how Jesus healed this man and his life was utterly transformed. I've often been puzzled by the method that Jesus healed this man. If you remember, he actually spit on the ground and rubbed mud into this man's eyes and then told him to go to the pool of Siloam and to wash his face. And he went, and after washing his face, he came back and he was able to see. Now, why did Jesus have to use spit? Why did Jesus have to use mud to heal this man is a mystery to me. And I won't be able to answer that question for us today. I remember at the end of one service, somebody came up to me and had come upon a very brilliant solution or an answer to that question. They said that Jesus knew a little bit about Chinese medicine. And there was something in Jesus' saliva, and there was something in the mixing of saliva and dirt and mud that was medicinal, that was able to bring vision to this man. Well, I think it probably take more faith to believe in that than it would be to believe that Jesus actually was able just to heal him. But anyway, it's a mystery to me why Jesus had to use saliva and mud. He could have certainly just said something. He could have certainly just touched that person. And so that might be a question we can ask Jesus when we get to heaven. I don't know if you have a list of those. I actually have a growing list of questions that I want to ask Jesus when I get to heaven. For instance, what did he write on the ground with his finger in John chapter 8? John does not tell us, but he tells us twice over that Jesus knelt down and wrote something on the ground with his finger. But we'll need to wait till heaven to find out what exactly he wrote on the ground. But anyway, I think the importance is it's a work of transformation. And this person's life was utterly different because of Jesus' hand, healing hand upon him. And certainly that is the message that we take with us. Well, then just very quickly, lastly, it is also a work of testimony. There in chapter 3, it says that the work, or verse 3, sorry, that the work of God would be manifested in his life. And that word manifest actually is also an important word in the Gospel of John. Well, I think all of that, just as a background, for our thoughts this morning. What I'd like to do is to, very quickly, we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to just take us through 10 trends that I see in missions. Now, let me give you just a little bit of background. Mimi and I, my wife and I, we've been involved with missions. We're a part of OMF International, formerly called the China Inland Mission. But in 1990, we joined OMF. And so for the last 30 years, we have served on the mission field. And we thank God for that experience. And in many ways, what I'd like to share with you this morning is a little bit of just my reflections of what God is doing on the mission field today. Now, before you sort of tune out and say, well, that's out there somewhere, one of the things that we will highlight actually is as we look at missions today and as we look at the migration of people, we'll find that actually missions is on our very doorstep. And so please don't tune out thinking that we're talking about, oh, well, this is something that happens in Asia or something that happens in Africa that is unrelated to us. I think you'll find very quickly that we're talking about things that are very, very practical and very, very pertinent to even us living here in the greater San Diego area. But these represent 10 trends according to Jaime Taylor. And I say that very intentionally because if you were to bring in somebody else who has been involved in missions, he might come up or she might come up with 10 other trends that would be also very, very significant. So there's a degree of subjectivity, according to Jaime Taylor, in what I'm going to share with us this morning. So it's 10 trends as I see it from my perspective. And so I want to highlight that at the very forefront. But anyway, what are the 10 trends? The first one is what I have been called the polycentric global missional movement. Now, sorry, that's maybe a big, long phrase with some terms that we're not necessarily familiar with, probably particularly polycentric, 多中心 in Chinese, polycentric. That as we look at global missions in the 21st century, it is no longer the case that missions, global missions, is the West to the rest. Now that phrase actually was used just over 100 years ago. Actually in 1910, there was a mission conference in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. It was probably one of the first meetings, gathering of the global missional movement. And so there were about 1,200 mission practitioners, mission leaders that attended this conference in Edinburgh in 1910. Not long ago, I was reading the record of that conference, and it was very interesting because a lot of the questions that they were talking about are questions that still are very challenging for missions in the 21st century. Issues, for instance, like polygamy in Africa. How do you deal with 多妻 polygamy? How do you deal with that kind of a cultural issue from the perspective of a church or a Christian or from the Christian faith? When the culture around you believes and accepts polygamy, what do you do as a pastor? What do you do as a church? If the elder has several wives, is he allowed to be an elder? And that was an issue that they wrestled with 100 plus years ago, but I'll tell you today that still is an issue in Africa. Well, another issue that they were wrestling with 100 years ago was the whole issue of ancestor worship. That's probably a little closer to us as Chinese, or certainly from an Asian context. You know, at what point is remembering your ancestors an honorable thing and an important thing and an acceptable thing, but yet at what point does it become actually something that goes contrary to Scripture? Is taking up joss sticks biblical? Can Christians worship their ancestors? And I'll tell you that continues to be an issue, especially among Chinese, even to this very day. So it was very interesting to study and to see some of the issues that they were wrestling with 100 plus years ago. Well, out of this 1,200 participants, there was actually only, I think if I remember correctly, 18 from the non-Western world. So out of 1,200, only 18 came from other parts of the world that we would term non-Western, or actually another term maybe I can just throw. I don't have it on the PPT, on the overhead. But there's a term that we use in missions today. We refer to the non-Western world as the majority world. It's sometimes referred to as the developing world. It's sometimes referred to as the two-thirds world, etc. But in missions, we use this word majority world. And when we talk about the majority world, we're referring primarily to the Latin world, the Latino world, to the African world, and to the Asian world. And that's what we call the majority world. Well, there was only 18 from the majority world 100 plus years ago. Interestingly, if you go and read the record of this conference, one of the phrases that came out was this very phrase, the West to the rest. Because back 100 years ago when we looked at missions, it was the Western church, whether here in North America, whether in Europe, including the UK, or Australia and New Zealand. Those were the places that were sending missionaries out. And let me just pause there very quickly, because I think we need to thank God for the faithfulness of the West in sending the missionaries out, whether that is to the Latino world, to the African world, or to the Asian world, including China, including if you're from Taiwan. Certainly missions came to Taiwan in 1865. Up in the north was George Mackay, Ma Jie. Some of you will be familiar with that story. In the south, Ma Ya Ge, James Meadows, came to the south and was involved in missions. And so these missionaries came, they responded with faithfulness, and they brought the gospel to the majority world. Well, 100 years later, we see that the majority world has grown, and it has grown exponentially. It has matured. And in that maturity, they have also then been involved and started to get involved in missions, in cross-cultural missions. And so as we look at missions in the 21st century, one of the things that very much excites me is this whole idea of missions is no longer from the West to the rest, but rather it is from anywhere to everywhere. And so there's this polycentric kind of dynamic as we look at missions, that a missionary is not a Westerner. Actually, to be honest with you, it was about 2000, AD 2000, that the number of non-Western missionaries exceeded the number of Western missionaries. And that has been the case up to this day as well. And so there are more non-Westerners working on the mission field today than there are Westerners. And so there's a partnership, there's a coming together of the global church in world missions. And that is the thing that very much excites me, because I think every culture and every people group have a unique contribution to bring to global missions. For many, many years, the West has led the way. But yet, I think all of us would acknowledge the fact that a Western perspective of Scripture, a Western perspective of the Christian life, could be biblical, but it is only one perspective. And that the majority world, for instance, the African world, or the Asian world, or the Latino world, also have an important contribution to bring to our understanding of Scripture and the implication of biblical truth in our lives. And certainly on the mission field, that is the case as well. Well, maybe that's all a bit abstract. Let me just give you several examples. Several years ago, I was working on my DMin dissertation. And my DMin dissertation basically was focused upon the missional movement, the emergence of the missional movement in China. That is a phenomenon that's very exciting today as we look at global missions, that missionaries are being sent out by China today. They're being sent first domestically within China, but they're also going out to other parts of the world, including the Middle East, including different parts of Asia, Central Asia, and even down into Africa, places like Ethiopia, places like Kenya, etc. Well, in my study, one of the questions that I asked was, what is the contribution of the Chinese church, especially the church in China, to global missions? What is their contribution? What is their unique contribution to global missions? Well, there's many ways to answer that question. But very quickly, several things that came to mind as I was doing my research. And this was actually a question that I put before them and challenged them to think about. Their contribution, their unique contribution. Well, it was very interesting. One of the things that emerged was the contribution of a house church model of doing church. Sorry, that might not sound very comfortable to some of us. What does doing church exactly mean? Well, a house church model of a church. This is very, perhaps, not common in the United States. But if you're familiar with the church in China, you'll know that the house church movement is a very significant movement within China, that many congregations are not meeting in big church buildings as we would meet in big church buildings in the West, but rather they're meeting in homes, in houses. That's the term house church. Well, actually, if we look at missions in the 21st century, we will find that one of the greatest needs in global missions is in parts of the world where actually to become a Christian, you could probably very quickly encounter difficulty and perhaps even persecution. So, for instance, the Muslim world, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But in the Muslim world today, you will not be able to build a big church, a 1,000-seater church for people to gather together. It will not happen. Instead, you will have to use a house church model to plant churches in the Muslim world. Well, you'll forgive me if I'm not in tune with the West and not in tune with America here, but I would say very quickly that probably for Americans, they know very little about how to run a house church. We know about running 1,000 congregation or maybe even 10,000 congregation. A mega church, we know a lot about that. But how do you actually run a house church is probably something that, in terms of our experience, we do not have much experience about. And so that would be a unique contribution that the Chinese church, the church in China, could bring to world missions. And so one of the things I share with my brothers and sisters from China is don't always run to Korea or run to Singapore or even come to the United States to study about Saddleback or to study about Willow Creek or whatever other mega church might be here. That's not to say we can't learn something from them. But we have a unique heritage. The church in China has a unique heritage of a house church model of doing church that actually is very important, strategic in global missions. And so that would be a contribution. Well, just very quickly, another contribution that emerged was familiarity with persecution, familiarity with oppression, something that we might know a little bit about here in America, but actually we know very little in comparison to other places where they do not enjoy the kind of religious freedom that you and I enjoy here in the United States. Even to gather like this in China today, unless you're meeting in a government-approved church, even a gathering like this today in China is considered illegal, and we would not be able to have this gathering. And so the church in China is very unique, is unique in terms of having that kind of an experience of living in a context of opposition, of oppression, and even persecution that the church in the West knows very little about. But I can tell you very quickly, and we might touch on it a bit later, but what is left of global missions is actually all hard soil. All the easy work has been done. What's left is very difficult people groups to reach with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in many instances, in those places, to become a Christian, whether it's the Muslim world, whether it's the Buddhist world, whether it's the Hindu world, anyone out of those people groups to become a Christian more than likely will mean that they will enter, or they will face opposition. They will face oppression. They will even face persecution and perhaps even death. And so the Chinese church, the church in China, has a unique perspective on what it means to live under that kind of context, and that can inform the missional movement, the global missional movement. So this polycentric dynamic, I think, is very important for us to see. And I'm very excited about this because, as I said, I think it brings a contribution from the global church to missions, to spirituality, to application of biblical truth in our lives that becomes then multi-dynamic, multi-dimensional. And I think that is very important, and it allows us to see the fullness in greater measure of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, there's much more we can say about all of that. Let me just quickly add this polycentric. I've talked about the majority world, but in my own thinking, the majority world, it includes the Latino world, the African world, the Asian world that we've already highlighted, but it also includes the ethnic churches that emerge out of those three parts of the world. So, for instance, the Chinese church here in North America. We're not in Asia, but we're an extension of the Chinese church here in North America. And the ethnic church in North America has a very important role to play in missions, whether that's the Chinese church or the Korean church. And so I think it's exciting to realize the world that we live in. Secondly, I've entitled The Unfinished Task of World Evangelism. And certainly I think as we look at missions in the world today, we will see that the task is not finished. Missiologists tell us that there are probably somewhere around 7,000 unreached people groups in the world today. 7,000 unreached people groups. 7,000 groups who still need to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. That represents about 42% of the world's population. Just very quickly, this term unreached people groups, this is a term that we use often in missions. And what we mean when we talk about unreached people groups is if a people group that can actually be found not only in a geopolitical country, it spills over perhaps into other countries. So, for instance, the Miao people of China, Miaozu, you can find them in places like Hunan. You can find them in places like Guizhou. You can find them in places like Yunnan. But actually, you can also find Miao people in Thailand. But they're not called Miao there. They're called Hmong. But they are from a close akin people group. They're connected together. So they step over geopolitical boundaries. So people groups are found right across the world, and they might not be confined in terms of geopolitical boundaries. But 7,000. And when we talk about unreached people group, what we're meaning is that any people group that has less than a 2% Christian population, we still refer to them as unreached people groups. Less than 2%, 少于2%. We call them 未得之民或者未及之民, the unreached people group. So there are about 7,000 in the world today. Well, just very quickly, let me just highlight several groups, and actually we've already touched on them as well. But some of the major groups that we're looking at when we talk about world evangelism, obviously the biggest group in the world today is the Muslim world. That by far is the largest challenge of global missions today. How can we effectively reach the Muslim world with the gospel of Jesus Christ? There's about 1.7 billion Muslims in the world today. 1.7. Now, that figure is perhaps hard to get our heads around. Probably very few of us, if any of us in this room today, have $1.7 billion in our bank account. If you do, I want to meet you after the service because I think there's a lot you can do for global missions and invest your life in eternal significance, not just earthly success. But what does 1.7 billion look like? Well, imagine together with me if every second 50 people walk in front of us. Every second 50 people walk in front of us. Do you know how long it would take for 1.7 billion people to walk in front of us? It would take over 10 years. Every second 50 people walk in front of us. It would take over 10 years for 1.7 billion people to walk in front of us. That's the population of the Muslim world today. And I think every Christian or any church that claims to have a vision and a burden for missions must address the critical question of how can we reach the Muslim world more effectively. And that includes how to understand the Muslim world. Not all of them are terrorists. What is their worldview? What is their culture? What is their religion? What are some ways that bridges can be built and hostility can be lowered and acceptance so that we could have the opportunity of sharing with them the good hope that we have in Jesus Christ, the eternal hope, the confidence that we have in Jesus Christ. The Muslim world is the largest block of people. Incidentally, if you're from China, we know in China there are 55 minority groups. There are 56 people groups, one of which are the Han Chinese. But the other 55 are 少数民族. They are the minority groups. And out of those 55 minority groups, there are 10 that are Muslim background minority groups, the largest of which are the Uyghurs in northwest China, actually the Hui people, a minority group, also a Muslim background minority group. But the Muslim world is the largest that we see as we look at missions today. Very quickly, the second group is the Buddhist world. Probably just about 1 billion Buddhists as well in the world today. Certainly those of us from a Chinese background, we're very familiar, whether that is from China, certainly Taiwan, we would be very, very familiar with the Buddhist world. But it also includes places like Thailand. It also includes places like Japan, etc. So the Buddhist world within Asia. Last December, Mimi, my wife, and I had a chance to visit Nepal, the Himalaya mountains, the Himalaya regions. And if you have ever been to that part of the world, it is also very staunchly Buddhist. Well, actually, there's quite a mixture of Buddhism, of Hinduism, as well as Islam in that part of the world. But from Bhutan over to Nepal, actually spilling over into Tibet, part of China, and also Qinghai, which is another province in the northwest part of China. 1 billion Buddhists need to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so this also needs to be very much at the front and center as we look at the unfinished task. Just very quickly, the third largest group in terms of religion is actually the Hindu world. Hinduism. Do you know how many gods there are in Hinduism? There are over 100 million gods in Hinduism. So try to figure all of that out. Obviously in India, but certainly in places like Nepal, as I've also mentioned, as immigrants from India go to other parts of the world, Hinduism has followed them as well. And so this represents another huge challenge for us. About 700 million Hindus in the world today. And so how can we effectively reach that group of people? Well, there are certainly other groups. The atheist world, the agnostic world, and perhaps we can even include the Western world. And so the task of missions is still unfinished. Interestingly, Hudson Taylor, my great-great-grandfather, the first book that he wrote was entitled China, Its Spiritual Need and Claims. China, Its Spiritual Need and Claims. 中国属灵的需要与托付. The spiritual need of China and the claims. And if you have a chance to ever read that book, one of the messages that comes through very, very strongly in that book is this idea of the unfinished task. As he looked at China, and this was obviously 150 years ago, there were 300 million Chinese in Hudson Taylor's day. That's equivalent to the population of the United States today, if I'm not mistaken. Well, China already hit 300 million 150 years ago. So the United States has a long way to go to catch up to China. I don't think we will, and I don't think we intend to. But anyway, that's beside the point, perhaps. But in that book, he talks about just the task, the responsibility of us reaching these 300 million Chinese. One of the fascinating stories that appears in that book is the story that of a testimony, an experience that he had actually when he was preaching in and around Ningbo, which is near Shanghai, in the central part on the coast of China. And a young man, after hearing Hudson Taylor, asked him this very poignant question: how long has the gospel been in your country? And before Hudson Taylor had a chance to answer that question, he went on to talk about, this young man went on to talk about how his father sought for the truth that he heard Hudson Taylor share about that day. How his grandfather sought also for the truth, but never found it. Whether it's in animism, whether it's in Buddhism, whether it's in Taoism, whether it's in Confucianism. Never found it. How long has the gospel been in your country? And Hudson Taylor answered the question for several hundred years. And this young man said this to Hudson Taylor: why have you taken so long to come? Why have you taken so long to come? The unfinished task. China, its spiritual need and claims. The world and its spiritual need and claims. The challenge of postmodernity amidst pluralism. 多元 pluralism 多元化，我们生活在一个多元化的 postmodernity in Chinese would be 后现代主义，后现代主义。We live in what is often been referred to as a postmodern society, and there are many things that we can highlight about that. But just as we're talking about missions today, I want to focus or confine my thoughts on postmodernity, 后现代主义. In its impact on the Christian faith as well as on missions. Well, one of the themes of postmodernity is the denial of any form of absolute truth. Postmodernity lives in a world of relativism, 相对主义, where everything is relative, that there are no absolutes in the world today. Well, having said that, there is one absolute that they acknowledge, and that is absolutely everything is relative. So, well, if everything is relative, even their insistence on everything being relative should also be relative. But anyway, that's beyond the point. A flaw in their logic. But its implication, obviously, for the Christian faith is, if everything is relative, is that Jesus is no longer the truth. He's at most only a truth, which is very difficult to translate into Chinese. The definite article the does not exist in Chinese because the Chinese language is a very 婉转. I'm not sure how to translate that into English. 差不多大概那样吧. It's a very fluid language, and so the idea of being so absolute about things. And so in John chapter 14, verse 6, where Jesus says, 我是道路, 我是真理, 我是生命, I am the way, the truth, the life. In the Chinese Bible, you cannot translate this term, the definite article, the. It doesn't appear. And so we're left with the idea of, well, is Jesus the way or is he a way? Is he the truth or is he a truth? Is he the life or is he a life? And of course, we know that actually Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. That there is no other way to the Father but through me. Which actually runs very much against postmodernity. Because everything is relative. And so faith or truth becomes relative. Well, not only truth becomes relative, but moral standards become very personal. You have your moral standard. I have my moral standard. Don't project your moral standard on me. Live and let live, I think is probably the term that best summarizes postmodernity. And of course, we see all the implications in the world, in the United States, with regard to how this mentality is fleshed out. That, we have to not only respect them, we have to embrace them. And so postmodernity talks about morals being a very personal thing. And actually, one step further, faith becomes a very private thing. And so we see within American society that faith is very privatized. You can keep it in your home, you can keep it at the church, but don't bring it into the school. Don't bring it into the workplace. Respect my space. Respect my space. Well, all of that actually impacts evangelism. All of that actually impacts missions as well. And so there's a tremendous challenge of postmodernity on missions today. Why should we go share the gospel with Tibetan Buddhists? They have their own religion. And if all roads lead to Rome, 条条大路都通罗马. If all roads lead to Rome, they have sufficient light in their faith to find their way to whatever. And so we have no business going to tell them that their faith, their belief is wrong, that they need to believe in Jesus Christ. And so oftentimes missions gets a bad rap from anthropologists, from people that are involved in social sciences, because they feel that we are destroying other cultures. Well, we need to go and respect those cultures, but the balance of sharing the truth with them, that Jesus is the only way, that there's no name from heaven above or on earth below through whom we can be saved. And so this challenge of postmodernity is something that very much is at the very center of the cultural war, if I can use that term, that we're involved in today. And it's not, let me tell you, your children, if you are parents in our midst and they go to public schools here in the United States, I have no doubt in my mind that these are issues, whether we talk to them about it or not. These are issues that they are grappling with, that they are facing in schools. Teachers are teaching from a postmodernity perspective and how that shapes our children. And so the responsibility of us as parents, the responsibility of us as a church or churches, is to help our children come to a clear understanding of the Christian faith in the midst of this kind of onslaught of postmodernity philosophy. So very much a challenge as we look at missions in the world today. The fourth area I've entitled the proximity of the mission field. The proximity of the mission field. Just very quickly, as we look at just some global trends from a general perspective, obviously one of the things we see very quickly is that we live in a migratory age. We live in an age where people are on the move. And they're moving for many, many different reasons. For instance, in China, for those of you who are from China, we know that China is urbanizing very, very quickly. People are moving from the countryside into the city at unprecedented levels. We call them migrant workers by and large. 民工 is the term that we use in China. Do you know that the Minggong in China, those who are coming from rural parts of China into urban parts of China, actually there are some 300 million Minggong in China today, which represents the population of the United States. 300 million moving from rural parts into urban parts of China. And so urbanization is a key factor within China today. An issue that the political party or the government has to wrestle with from the top all the way down to the bottom. How do you deal with urbanization, the migration of people into cities? Let me pause there very quickly. One of the things that the Lord has very much laid on our hearts these days is to notice and to think through how can we effectively reach the children affected by urbanization in China today. Children, we call them left behind children, 留守儿童 in Chinese, left behind children. The government tells us that there are probably somewhere in the vicinity of 40 to 50 million left behind children in China today. But as is often the case with government statistics, they're not quite exact. And probably the figure is closer actually to 100 million left behind, 留守儿童, or actually also 流动儿童. These are two different categories. One is they stay in rural parts of China. Others, the 流动儿童, travel with their parents into the city. And so you have migrant schools, 民工小学. You have migrant schools in cities because of this people movement. 100 million migrant children, whether they stay back in the rural parts or if they go into the cities. 100 million. That represents a significant portion of China's population. A significant portion of China's population that is growing up out of the context of a normal family environment. And maybe that word normal is a tricky word. What is normal? But just think for a moment. When they enter adulthood, what will be their concept of family? What will be their concept of a marriage? And how does that concept impact their lives? And how will that actually impact society? For we know that actually the base of society, the stability of society is actually based on the stability of a family. The stability of the family is based on the stability of a marriage. And just think in 15, 20 years, well, probably not even that, 10 years, as they enter into adulthood, what will be 他们的婚姻观, 他们的家庭观, their view of marriage, their view of the family, and how will that impact Chinese society? It's a huge issue. How can we minister? How can we mobilize the church to minister to this group of people? Tremendous challenge, but yet also a tremendous opportunity. But this migration, the other thing that I just want to highlight, though, here is this migration is not only urbanization, but it's also transnational migration. And this is where the proximity of the mission field comes into play. As we look at this migration, this movement of people, we see that people are on the move. They're moving, they're migrating for many different reasons: education, for immigration, for business, for profession. It might be because of persecution, whatever. But they're moving into other parts of the world. And with that movement, actually, we see the distance between us and the mission field shortened considerably. That the mission field is no longer out there somewhere, but rather the mission field is actually here on our very doorstep. Let me just give you a very simple example. A very simple example. Not long ago, I was in the city of Toronto, and they told me that actually in downtown Toronto, there's a part of downtown Toronto that is called Little Tibet. Little Tibet. And they told me that actually there are probably close to 10,000 Tibetans living in Toronto today. God has brought Tibet to Toronto. That the church in Toronto, while God might call it to go to Tibet, has also brought Tibet to Toronto. And they can begin to reach Tibetans in Toronto. They don't have to get on a plane and fly to Lhasa. But that they can reach Tibetans right there in the city where they live. And so that proximity has shortened of the mission field. That we as church or churches today need to look around us to see God's invisible hand actually bringing people from all parts of the earth to the San Diego area. So I'm not familiar with the San Diego area. But I'm almost certain, given the very nice weather that you guys often enjoy here, that this is a very high premium in terms of migrants coming from right across the world. It could be from other parts of Asia, it could be from the Middle East, etc., etc. But that distance between us and the mission field is shortened considerably. So we don't have to get on a plane, and we can begin to reach out to, whether it's Tibetans or Pakistanians or Afghans or refugees from Syria, etc. The list can go on and on. It happens right here on our doorstep, brothers and sisters. And I think from one perspective, that is a very exciting thing for me, because you and I are not called to Tibet. Well, okay, one or two might be going to Tibet, but as a whole, we as a church, we aren't going to Tibet. But that doesn't rule out the opportunity we have of reaching out to Tibetans right here on our doorstep, to use that example. And the whole church can be mobilized to reach out to the Tibetans. Are there Tibetans in San Diego? 不知道哈. Probably there are, but anyway. But you understand what I'm saying? Yes, God will send people to Tibet, and they need to go, but yet very few will go there. The majority of us are staying here. And yet we as a church, as a congregation, or as congregations of churches, we can reach out to the people that God has brought to our very doorstep. And so as I reflected upon this, the sentence that came foremost to my mind is the proximity of the mission field tests our sincerity for the mission field. The proximity of the mission field tests our sincerity for the mission. 宣教工厂的远近考验我们对宣教工作的真诚。If we don't reach Tibetans in Toronto, I don't think getting on an airplane and flying to Lhasa will make us missionaries with a burden to reach the Tibetans in Tibet. So that proximity tests our sincerity. A tremendous challenge for us to reflect upon, but an exciting opportunity for us as church or as churches to be involved in missions. Fifthly, and I'm going to go over time, my apologies. I don't think we'll have an hour worth of questions, so, well, maybe we will, but anyway, I won't let you to give me an hour worth of questions. The fifth area, the whole church mobilized, and in parentheses there, CAN missiology. CAN stands for Creative Access Nation. And basically, I think what we're talking about here are places in the world today, and they're increasing significantly, but places in the world today where missionaries cannot go. Where missionaries cannot go, but Christians can go. And there's a difference there. Certainly we hope missionaries are Christians. But not all Christians are missionaries in the traditional definition of this word, missionaries. Just in Asia, 80% of Asia's population lives where traditional missionaries like Jaime Taylor. I cannot get a visa to go to a place like Laos. I cannot get a visa to go to a place like North Korea. I can't get a visa to go to a place like Brunei and other parts of Asia. You cannot get missionary visas to go to those places. But as we, I think, mentioned just very quickly yesterday evening, as we look at those places, even though missionaries cannot go, we see that Christians can go via their professions, and that is the background of mobilizing the whole church. Because in the past, as we thought about missions, we always thought, well, you know, a missionary should be 长这个样子, that a missionary should be like this kind of a person. A very traditional definition of a missionary. They go to seminary and they work in a church for several years. They join a mission agency and then they're sent out as a missionary. That's the stereotype of a missionary in most of our minds, which still applies. There are still places, Taiwan, where Mimi and I live. A missionary can go to Taiwan or to the Philippines or to Thailand, etc. But increasingly, as I mentioned, increasingly, missionaries cannot gain entrance into those places. But they're not closed. They're closed to missionaries, but they're not closed to Christians to use their professions as a platform to live in those places, to work in those places, and to be a witness for Jesus Christ in those places. And so I think the question that we need to wrestle with is, how do we use our profession to profess our faith? Isn't it interesting? This word profession actually is not only a verb, it is also a noun. What is your profession? What is your job? What is your occupation? But this word profession also can be used in the sense that a profession of faith. We go to a Presbyterian church in Taipei. Well, when I'm not preaching, we go to a Presbyterian church in Taipei, which doesn't happen very often. And I'm not familiar with your church, but our church in Taipei, every Sunday we recite together the Apostles' Creed. That is a part of our ritual. That is a profession of faith. 一个信仰的告白, a profession of faith. And so I think the challenge that we have is, how do we see our professions as a profession of our faith? And how do we mobilize Christians, again, to use that phrase, not to seek after earthly success that their professions might give them, but rather eternal significance? How can God use your profession, my profession? How can God use your job, my job, for the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ? So I often say, God does not call all of us to be 传道人, to be pastors, but He calls all of us to be 传道的人. And that's very hard to translate into English. Maybe the "de" is our definite article in Chinese that can't be translated into English. But you know, you add that "de" in the middle, it's a bit different, isn't it? We're not all preachers, but we're all proclaimers. Maybe that's a way of putting it. And so, how do we mobilize the Christian profession or the Christian population to use their professions in cross-cultural missions? Well, some of these I think I'll need to cover a little more quickly, or else we won't be done by 12 o'clock. I won't have any time for your questions. Just very quickly, the sixth area to highlight, the whole gospel to the whole person. And certainly, I think what we're talking about here, highlighting here especially, is the importance of not only seeing the spiritual needs of people, but also seeing the physical needs, the emotional needs, etc., of people being addressed, being dealt with, or being addressed as in our mission strategy. And not in just our mission strategy, but also in terms of our strategy of our churches, and how can we effectively reach the whole person with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so a whole host of issues, whether it's in terms of ecology, in terms of environment, in terms of addiction, etc. All of these things, all of these areas become parts and parcels of what we need to present as the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so bringing the holistic gospel, the whole gospel to the whole person, a very important part. Seventhly, the balance of ST stands for short-term missions and LT stands for long-term missions. A balance of short-term missions and long-term missions. My great-great-grandfather, Hudson Taylor, took 163 days to get from Liverpool, England to Shanghai, China, when he first went to China in 1853. 163 days. Well, today, if we were to fly from Heathrow, which is the main airport in the London area, and we were to fly to Pudong, which is the main airport, the international airport in Shanghai, it would take us probably about 12, maybe 13 hours. And so what took my great-great-grandfather and those early missionaries nearly half a year to do, you and I can do in half a day. And so we live in an age of what I call the convenience of transportation. And that has greatly impacted missions in the 20th and the 21st century. Back in Hudson Taylor's day, if you go and read any of the missionary literature of that day, 宣教的文献, the missionary literature, you would not find this term, short-term missions, in any of their writing. And rightly so. It took 163 days just to get to China. Presumably, it would take another 163 days to get back. And so, if my math serves me correctly, that's 326 days just to get to and back from the mission field. And for all of us, that's almost long-term right there. So the convenience of transportation has had a tremendous impact on missions. And we can do short-term missions. We can fly to other parts of the world at unprecedented speeds. Could I also add, at unprecedented safety as well? I mean, it's, okay, yeah, when a plane falls, a lot of people die. But relatively speaking, air travel is fairly safe in the world that we live in today. And I'm a testimony of flying for 30 years. And God has protected. I don't take that for granted, believe me. But it is relatively safer for us today. And so short-term missions is something that we very much see within the church today. Several years ago, OMF, the organization that we're a part of, did a survey, and we found that 80% of our so-called career missionaries began their missionary experience through short-term missions. And I think through that survey, we came to realize that actually short-term missions, if done right, can have a huge impact on a person's life and could be an avenue whereby God leads that person to a longer commitment in cross-cultural missions, wherever that might be found. And so that very much showed us the importance of short-term missions, but yet also to see how to do short-term missions right, and yet to also realize that in some instances, people will not be reached through short-term. The whole Muslim world will not be reached through short-term missions. It will not happen. Because we need to go to them, we need to earn their trust, we need to earn their acceptance, to use an often quoted phrase. They need to know how much we care before they care how much we know. And we need to earn their trust. We need to earn a right to be heard, to say something about our Christian faith within a Muslim context. And that could include actually learning their language, whether that's Arabic or whether the Uyghur, Kazakh, etc. To learn their language, because through that kind of interaction, we earn their trust, we earn their acceptance, we earn a right to be heard. And short-term missions cannot achieve that. And certainly short-term missions cannot achieve seeing a church built and seeing a church built up. And so there needs to be a good balance between short-term missions and long-term missions. In terms of short-term missions, I think it is important for us as a church or as churches to really have a good understanding of what goes into short-term missions. And that includes the pre-mission, the pre-trip training that needs to take place, the prayer that needs to take place, investing in short-term missions. When they go onto the mission field, wherever that might be, what are they going to do there? How many people are going? When are they going? What are they going to do? Who are they going to interact with? Who is the long-term missionary there that they can relate to, or the church, the local church there that they can relate to? Because after all, we as short-termers are going to leave within 7 to 10 days. And so something needs to continue on there. Certainly God continues on there, I realize that. But if there's a church that we can link into, or if there are missionaries that we can link into there, that allows them to carry on the work that we did together with them. And that raises an important point of us partnering with missionaries or partnering with churches and being sensitive to whether we come at the right time for them, whether too many people are coming to them. It actually relates to how we do things there as well. You know, and we might go with a desire to pass out as many tracts as possible, and yet if we're going to a place where passing out tracts is not helpful, then it behooves us not to pass out tracts there. There was a church in Singapore that believed very strongly in what they called tracking, passing out tracts. Well, they were in a part of China. I won't tell you what part. But what they did was they went to a city, and from this part of the city to the other part of the city, they rented a car, they rolled down the window, the driver took them through, and they threw out tracts from the window. And of course, their philosophy was as long as one person kneels down and picks up this tract and reads it and becomes a Christian, then the whole trip was worth it. Which, okay, yes, the conversion of one person brings great joy in heaven. But could I tell you that that one trip from this part of the city to that part of the city actually jeopardized the long-term people who were living there, working there, and they were almost all kicked out of that city just because of that one Singaporean church that believed in tracking. Well, maybe there could be a debate on whether it was worth it or not. All that just to say, I think as we do short-term missions, we need to be sensitive to the context there. And it behooves us not to jeopardize what the long-term workers there have sought to establish. Even though we might go with some different expectations, and we need to adjust that. But then obviously not only that during time, but I think even more important is when short-termers come back, it's important for us to engage with them. What has God taught you through this short-term experience? How is your life going to be different? And it's that part that I think is so critical, and yet that part is so hard to measure. I mean, it's easy to say, 感谢赞美主, praise the Lord. This year we had 20 people go out in short-term missions. That's a numerical number, very easy to qualify, to quantify. But that follow-up work is so much more difficult and so much harder, and that demands so much more time and journeying with those people and challenging them to think through, well, how is your life going to be different because of going to Mexico, going to Tijuana, or going to Arizona to work among the Native Americans, or whatever it might be? What are the lessons that you have learned? And so this balance of short-term and long-term missions is a very important balance that we need to have. I was in a church, actually in the central part of the United States, and the pastor was very excited, shared with me short-term missions in their church, and very quickly I realized something very interesting, because every year they went to a different place. So this year they went there to do short-term missions. The next year they went to another place. The third year they went to another place. And finally, I probably really committed a cultural blunder because at the end of it all, I said, why do you go to different places every year? He said, well, if we went back to the same place, no one in the church would want to go. And my cultural blunder was, I said, well, we're not doing tourism. We're doing missions. 不是搞观光啊，我们搞宣教的。But, I think there's something to be said of going back over and over again to the same place and building on what we did last year or building on what we did 6 months ago. So rather than, going here, going there, going everywhere, it might be that, we as a church say, okay, this is going to be our focus, and this is where we're going to invest our time and our efforts and our personnel. And going back there every year to build on that foundation. Going back, we have several who go to China. They go to the southwest part of China every year. We call them non-residential long-termers. That's the term we have for them. Non-residential long-termers. They go back over and over again to the same place. It's interesting, people in right there will say, well, don't you go to Beijing to see Wanli Changcheng, to see the Great Wall? No. Or don't you go to Xi'an also to see Bing Mayong, to see the terracotta figures? No. We come only here every year. And that has a tremendous statement. That makes a tremendous statement to the local people. A tremendous impact. So the balance between short-term and long-term missions. We make them, we mark them, and we mature them. The Great Commission of Jesus Christ was to go to the other ends of the earth, to make disciples, to baptize them, and to instruct them to obey everything that I have taught you. Simply to say, our mission strategy should be a discipleship strategy. 门徒导向的宣教策略. We're called not to make believers, although we certainly hope disciples are believers as well. But we're called to make disciples. And so our strategy, could I very quickly add, that should be the strategy of our churches as well, right? If our strategy is just to make believers, I think our churches will be very immature and very weak. But our call is to make believers of all nations. And so that impacts what we do in terms of helping them grow in the faith, mature in the faith, and be involved in ministry, whatever that might take, whatever form that might take. And so really I think to have that kind of a focus. It's so easy to just focus on how many people raised their hand and accepted Jesus Christ. Or how many people were baptized. Those are all very easily measurable goals. This year we want to see 30 people baptized. This year we want to see 50 people baptized. Those are all very measurable goals. Very good in and of themselves. The making of disciples is the messy part. That's the difficult part because life is messy. And we have to journey with these people to grow in their faith. And that's so important for us on the mission field as well as certainly even here in the church. Ninth, very quickly, networks and partnerships. I am convinced that we live in the 21st century where partnerships are very, very important. If I can use the illustration of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, you'll remember the story. Jesus tells Peter to set out into the deep, 到水深之处. I'm not really sure the English version. I'm more familiar with the Chinese Bible. I do all of my devotions in Chinese. Interestingly, it's a very good way to learn a language. If you want to learn Chinese, start doing your devotions in Chinese. If you want to learn English or improve your English, start doing your devotions in English. But anyway, the story there in Luke chapter 5 of Peter going to the deep, and then Jesus telling him to throw over his nets, to cast his nets. And it's a wonderful picture of as he brought up the net, it was filled with fish, and and the net was about to be torn. And so Peter called John and James, his companions, to come and to help him. And so together with them, they brought up a whole net full of fish. Well, just think for me for a moment, what would have happened if Peter didn't call James and John to help him? He probably wouldn't have caught one fish, because all the fish that he caught would have gotten away because the net would have been torn. But it was only as he networked together with James and John, only as he partnered together with them, that they were able to have a whole host of fish. And as I think we look at missions in the 21st century, I think it's very important for an agency to partner together with churches. Meaningful partnership. Churches and churches partnering together. And even on the mission field, mission agencies partnering with indigenous churches. I believe we live in a day not of partisanship, but of partnership. And it's important for us to realize that. It is no longer about our logos, our silos, and our egos. But rather is how can we together see the fulfillment of the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. Very interesting, just maybe by way of an illustration. Several years ago, I was actually invited to Los Angeles to be a part of a gathering. It was a very interesting gathering because it was primarily of Western mission agencies and denominations. And I was invited together with about 40 of these mission agencies and denominations to have 3 days of strategizing on global missions. And we talked about a lot of different things, a lot of different opportunities, challenges, and missions. And as a result of those 3 days, one of the exciting things that came out of it was at the very end, the last day, the very last afternoon, as we were gathering together to pray and say, well, God, after these 3 days, what are you saying to us? What can we take away from these 3 days? And increasingly, in several of our hearts, there was a growing conviction that is there a way that these 40 organizations can partner together to see the gospel of Jesus Christ especially reached amongst several unreached people groups around the world today. And it ended up that we identified 3, one in Iran, one in India, and one in China. And subsequent to that, 40 of these denominations and agencies have partnered together in seeing resources set aside to reach these 3 unreached people groups. But I'll never forget the illustration that somebody gave that afternoon at the very end. They talked about fishing, and Patrick is a fisherman there in the back, and he will understand this illustration. If you go to Patrick's house in his garage, he has many fishing rods. But just imagine with me, and this was the illustration that was given. You go and fish with a fishing rod. How many fish can you fish? Well, you can only probably get one at a time. Right, Patrick? Have you gotten more than one at a time with one fishing rod? With one string, with one hook. Have you gotten more than one fish with one hook? You can only get one. Well, the illustration that afternoon, and I'll never forget the illustration, was what would happen if you tied those strings together? That there are 40, 50 rods, fishing strings here in our group. And you tie all of them together in knots. What you get? You would get a fishing net. And what could you catch with a fishing net? It would no longer be just one fish, but it would be fishes. Is fish plural or singular? It's like sheep. Is sheep plural or singular? Sheeps. Fishes. Network is so important today. So important. And then very quickly, lastly, thank you for your patience. I have gone well over time. cross-cultural missions. And I want to actually maybe perhaps just especially focus my thoughts on the Chinese church, because I think this is very, very critical for us as Chinese and as Chinese churches, for those of you here who are part of the Chinese church. I think as we look at missions, I think especially from the standpoint of a Chinese church, or maybe even more broadly speaking, from the standpoint of an ethnic church. You know, one of the exciting things about ethnic churches is because of language, linguistic, and cultural similarities, we have a tremendous opportunity to reach out to our kinsmen. So a Chinese church, it's a lot easier for us to reach other Chinese because we speak the same language. We're from the same culture. And so when they come to our church, we speak in Mandarin or speak in Cantonese or Taiwanese, whatever dialect. And it's very easy for us to reach them with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I certainly believe wholeheartedly in the strategic role of an ethnic church. But do you know what? Our greatest strength often also becomes our greatest weakness. Because with that kind of, and maybe the word ethnocentrism is not a good term, but with that kind of dynamic, it then makes it very, very difficult for us as a church to reach non-Chinese. And at that point, we see a glass wall emerge around ethnic churches. A glass wall that could be very clean and clear, and you almost cannot see it. Have you ever banged into a window thinking that it's not there? And that often becomes the case. That an ethnic church becomes so ethnically centered that it ceases to have a vision of reaching beyond its ethnicity. And that relates to us as a congregation or congregations, but even so, it also relates to the mission field. Because I believe in the 21st century, for the Chinese church, one of the greatest challenges that the Chinese church has is how can we also see the importance of reaching the non-Chinese of the world today with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me close with an illustration that happened just about 3, maybe 4 years ago. In 2015, our family had the chance of going to Barnsley, England. Barnsley is where Hudson Taylor was born and raised. One afternoon, we had a church service at a local church. It was quite a meaningful experience for me because they told me actually Hudson Taylor stood in the pulpit and preached from that very pulpit. And they said, Jaime, go up and stand in the pulpit. Actually, our son was with us, and his full name is James Hudson Taylor the Fifth. I'm the fourth. We have a real problem with creativity. We don't seem to be able to come up with new names. We just change the number at the end. So it's very easy, and my son has informed us that when they have a son, Lord willing, he will be James Hudson Taylor the Sixth. So we're hoping the Lord comes back before we get to the 8th, or people will say we're competing with Henry the 8th. But we stood in this pulpit. And they took a picture. After the service, elderly gentleman, he was a pastor, he came up to me, very, very moved, with tears in his eyes. And this is what he said to me. He said, 150 years ago, we sent a son of Barnsley to China with the gospel of Jesus Christ. He said, when will the Chinese church send a son of China back to Barnsley with the gospel of Jesus Christ? 150 years ago, we sent a son of Barnsley, Hudson Taylor, to China. But his cry that afternoon was that Barnsley needs missionaries. And wouldn't it be an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity for the Chinese church to actually send a missionary or missionaries back to Barnsley, back to England with the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Chinese church has a debt to pay. And I think we as the Chinese church need to awaken to the importance of cross-cultural missionaries. Don't get me wrong, reaching Chinese must still be our focus, but it cannot be our only focus. And I think that is where English congregations, if I can just bring it very much down to earth, that is where an English congregation of a Chinese church is so strategic, because that then becomes the bridge. And no one talked to me before the service, even though I'm staying at Patrick and Janet's house. But that becomes the bridge whereby we as an ethnic church can reach beyond our ethnicity with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because as those people come to the church, they come to an English-speaking service that allows them to worship in perhaps their own language, or a language that they are familiar with, as opposed to Chinese. And so the importance of an English congregation, it is not a glorified babysitting service for the Chinese congregation, but rather it needs to be seen as a strategic way whereby we as an ethnic church can reach beyond our ethnicity, which I believe is at the heart of God. Well, I have probably offended some people with those closing statements, but anyway, thank you very much for your patience. I ended up speaking for an hour and a half, and you have 20 minutes for questions or comments or feedback. Anyway, yes.
So we want to really thank Dr. Taylor for what he just shared, and I hope that was a powerful message for all of us. So I guess the way we want to do this is, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then Dr. Taylor can pick one of the hands, and then we want to get the mic to you so that we get it all recorded. So please wait for the mic before asking your question. Is that okay? Okay, so please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaime. My name is David. I'm a Sunday school teacher. I've been working for Janet for a number of years. Your great-great-grandfather is actually in the material. I've been talking about his story for many years, and I'm super excited to meet you. And here comes my question. Can you talk about, how does Hudson Taylor impact your faith, as an individual? And part of the question is, how does this faith got passed down into your family, generation after generation?
Very good, thank you. Well, if I had a nickel for every time that question was asked, I'd be a billionaire by now. No, very good question, yeah. And actually several questions in your one question. Certainly I think in terms of the carrying on of the faith, I think is something, obviously, ultimately it is God's grace. I don't think that there is a magic formula that our family has, that if you do A, B, C, and D, that it will pass on automatically. And so really, actually, the Christian faith came into our family 3 generations before Hudson Taylor. 4 generations, actually. So his great-grandfather was the first one in our family to come to faith. The Lord used a verse in Joshua chapter 24, which we're very familiar with. Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That was the verse that brought the conversion experience. And his name was James Taylor, too, so you can tell how bad we are with coming up with new names for our children, our sons especially. But 9 generations later, I really do not have some kind of a formula that I can give to you. Obviously, if there's a formula, it's God's grace. I think in terms of my own personal experience and my coming to faith, obviously growing up in a Christian family had a significant impact on me. I think when I was a teenager, I was a very rebellious teenager. And I think my parents' testimony during my teenage years of rebellion also had a tremendous impact on me that eventually also led to my conversion, because I saw very clearly that their faith was not a fair weather faith, that it wasn't just in the good times that they believed, but how could we have a son like this in our family? We're serving the Lord on the mission field. God, you should be blessing us rather than giving us a son like this. But I think through that experience, I just saw, their faith being lived out and their journey of faith being lived out, which at the time did not have a whole lot of impact on me. It was only looking back that I very much saw that my parents living out their faith in the home is so very important. So I think for parents, and for all of us, I'm a parent of 3, I think how we carry our faith back to home is a very important thing. If our kids can't see Jesus in us, it will be hard for them to be sold on the genuineness of this faith. It will be just a ritual that they do every Sunday until they're 18 and they're off to college and they can decide what they do on Sunday. And but even having said that, it's ultimately God's grace. And we need to just pray for his mercy on our family and our children. I'm sure my parents prayed often for me, for my 2 sisters. My father often shared of how he awoke one night finding his father, my grandfather, kneeling beside his bed, kneeling beside my father's bed, praying for him, praying for my father. So I think praying for our children, etc., are very important. Just in terms of Hudson Taylor's impact, I mean, I grew up hearing Hudson Taylor's stories, as you can about imagine. And certainly I think that has also impacted me tremendously. A man of faith, experiencing God, the provision of God in his life. All of those things. His love for the Chinese has had a big impact on me. Married a Chinese. First in my family to marry a Chinese. So that's identification at its most. So, yeah. But I think ultimately, I think the thing that challenges me is the prayer on my heart is just as Hudson Taylor was faithful in his generation and subsequent generations were faithful, that I need to be faithful in this generation to lead the way for my son and whatever, that he would be faithful in his generation. And so, yeah, very impactful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Other comments? Maybe just some feedback or comments on just what has been shared today as well. That would be good.
Dr. Jaime, I think it's really an honor for you to come to our church and share your faith. My name is Ben. So you talk about the 3 reached groups, right? The Latinos, the Asians, the Muslims. So what's your thought about the Jewish people? So the reason I'm asking is I have a coworker who is actually a close friend. He's Jewish. We talk about faith. Sometimes it's difficult for me to think how I can approach him and share. He obviously knows about Jesus, and he actually invited me to his temple, so I'm not sure how to manage the situation.
Yeah, very good. Well, certainly there are a lot of different groups, maybe just to respond very quickly to your first thought. I just highlighted the 3 larger groups, the Muslim group, the Buddhist group, and the Hindu group, just because population-wise they're the largest in the world. But that is certainly not to negate other groups, including the whole Jewish population, whether that is in Israel or elsewhere, in your case, even here in San Diego. And so I certainly would concur. I think it's important for us to think through how we can reach our friends, our coworkers, with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think there perhaps are several things, and you've obviously perhaps even thought of most of them. I think obviously praying for them, praying that God would speak into their lives, that God would speak through you, your interaction with him at work, what he sees in you, what does he see of our Christian faith in us? Are we living out our faith in a very practical way in our interactions with people, the way we talk to people, our attitudes in the midst of all of the challenges in our life? Is there a joy that is an unspeakable joy? I think all of that speaks tremendously to people without us perhaps even saying anything else about our Christian faith. I think perhaps familiarity with the Old Testament. There are over 1,200 prophecies of Jesus Christ that are found in the Old Testament. And I think that's a common denominator that we have with the Jewish faith, that is in the Old Testament. And I think if we were to go to look at the New Testament, look at the apostles in the book of Acts, many of their sermons went back to say, Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of these Old Testament prophecies. And so I think, how can we have a dialogue with him in a sensitive way, not in an arrogant way, an open dialogue, not that I want to convince you, that kind of approach, but just very openly sharing, this is what the Old Testament says, and it seems that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of this Old Testament or of that Old Testament prophecy, and allow the Holy Spirit in our sensitivity, allow the Holy Spirit to work. And so it's not maybe so much trying to convince him. Let the Holy Spirit do that convincing or convicting. But I think just being open to having dialogues that sound like you already have. And they won't be easy. And it wasn't easy for Paul either. It wasn't easy for Jesus. So don't be discouraged, I think, when we encounter problems, because that's nothing new. After all, Jesus had some real problems on his hands. The Apostle Paul didn't fare well in the synagogues. So certainly I think let us not be discouraged and be confident that God is at work in this person's life. And it might be 10 years down the road that you finally see this person turn to the Lord. Hopefully it'd be before then. But, I think leave the results in his hands. And I think we just need to, as Peter says, with humility and gentleness, share the hope that is within us. 用温柔的心帮我心中的盼望. There in the 3rd chapter of 1 Peter. So yeah, go on, press on, brother. Yeah, very good. Yeah, Hudson Taylor used to, every year the first donation he had was to an organization that was reaching out to the Jews. And he used, Paul's words, to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. And so his annual donation, his first donation, was to a Jewish organization, or an organization reaching out to the Jews, which I thought was very interesting. Yeah, very good. Thank you. God bless you, brother, and that very important work. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else?
So, Dr. Jaime, your last point about the strategic place of the English congregation of ethnicity church, like Chinese church, is very inspiring. Do you have any practical advice or how to go about to fulfill this strategic?
Well, that might be another session. No, I think it obviously just begins with a vision for that. Because if you don't have a vision for a church's English congregation to be the bridge to reach out into the community, if it doesn't begin with that from the standpoint of the leadership of the church, the pastoral staff of the church, I think it's fairly hard to implement. And we'll always see the English congregation as sort of helping us take care of our kids while we actually worship God. So I think it starts with a vision. Do we have a vision for our English congregation to help us as an ethnic church reach beyond our ethnicity? And I think with that vision then becomes, are we willing to pour into resources, into making that a reality in terms of financial resources, in terms of personnel, and put in those resources. It includes even having a meeting, if our English congregation is off in some side room, that communicates whether we see this as being an important part of our church's outreach. So where are we putting our resources? And it even maybe goes down to, challenging us in terms of our elders and deacons meetings. Maybe they need to be conducted in English. Because that then helps us maybe have people whose Chinese is not their mother tongue. That we bring them closer into this dialogue and this partnership of serving together. So in terms of the leadership and how do we communicate amongst ourselves. So those are maybe some areas that we can think through further on in terms of how to see that become more of a reality. But it's not an easy thing, and a lot of leadership styles need to be rethought, because I think there's a tremendous, and this is the word that I've heard and I agree, there's a tremendous hemorrhaging in the Chinese church of the second generation, because traditionally Chinese churches, we bring so much of our values and our way of doing things into the context of the church, that the second generation is not interested in staying in the Chinese church. And so in the America, at least, my understanding is you have this phenomenon of Asian churches emerging. Our daughter goes to an Asian church, and she says, I don't want to go to a Chinese church because it's too Chinese. But yet she doesn't want to go to a Caucasian church because there's an Asianness about her that yearns for Asians. So it's a phenomenon. But I think if and it might not be every church, but I think the Chinese church as a whole needs to awaken up. You know, I really struggle, to be honest with everybody. I really struggle with what is the role of an ethnic church in the kingdom of God. I'm not sure we have any biblical models of an ethnic church in the Bible. But anyway, I'm not negating an ethnic church. But I think we really need to be leery of the traps of ethnic churches. Our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. So our vision, are we willing to put resources, financial, personnel resources into our English congregation, and a freedom for them to take the church or that congregation in a way that can really minister to people beyond Chinese without really, being a parent kind of mentality. Yeah. Very good. Thank you. A lot more thinking, not much thinking, I think, including myself. We haven't thought enough about how to actually see that take place. I've been to Canada. As I mentioned, I was up in Toronto, and I've seen some examples of Chinese churches that have an effective outreach into the community. So their English congregation, actually over half of their English congregation is Caucasian, not Chinese. And so but it's interesting that all of those churches were Hong Kong Cantonese background churches as opposed to Mandarin churches, which there's another dynamic. There's a difference between 广东人、台湾人还是中国人。So yeah, there's some dynamics there. But I think a lot more thinking needs to take place there. Maybe you can do your master's or your DMin on that. Write a dissertation. Very good. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
I think everybody is hungry.
We have 1 minute.
Hi. I think when I listen to your sharing, I can always feel your passion. Are you always this passionate? And if sometimes you are not, what do you do?
Maybe my wife needs to answer that question. Yeah, when I speak, I tend to have a passion that might not be a bit different, I think, on the pulpit. I'm not sure how that all happens. But anyway, I tend to get very passionate about things when I start speaking and when I start preaching. And sometimes when I teach in seminaries, they'll say, well, you're not preaching today, you're just teaching, so don't get so excited. But anyway, I think a lot of these things are things that have been a part of my life for the last 30 years. And so they're very close to my heart. And the passion that God has given me for some of these things. And especially, I think, to try to help the Chinese church become even more involved in cross-cultural missions. So I think hopefully it's a passion, not a human-based passion, but a passion from God. But yeah, anyway, I'm not really answering the question. I don't know how to answer that question. But thank you. Yeah, very good. Maybe I could close with a word of prayer.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Why don't we all stand? You guys have been so great sitting for 2 hours. Not easy. But Father, we thank you for this morning. I thank you for each one here. Lord, I thank you for what you are doing in the world today. And as we began this morning, Lord, we thought of that familiar verse, as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who has sent me. Night is coming when we can no longer work. We thank you, Father, for that we that appears in that verse. And your invitation, Lord, for us as individuals, for us as churches, to be a part of what you're doing in the world today. And Lord, I want to acknowledge it's what you're doing. And the privilege, the honor that we have to be a part of that, whatever that might take, in whatever form it might be. Lord, I pray that you would continue to broaden our vision, Lord, to see what you are doing. And yet, Lord, just as the men of Issachar, or the sons of Issachar, who knew the times, and yet, Lord, and perhaps even more importantly, they knew what Israel should do. Help us to know what we should do to respond to, Father, what you are doing in the world today. We thank you, Father, for this morning. Lord, trust that you will place in our hearts messages, burdens that your Spirit has spoken to us, and perhaps what has been shared today as well. That you would let us leave this place with a fresh and a renewed determination, Lord, to be a part of what you are doing in the world today. And so, Lord, let your blessings be upon each and every one of us, knowing that you bless us so that we might bless and to be a blessing. And we'll be careful to give you all the praise and the glory in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Thank you.
Can we all thank Dr. Jaime Taylor one more time? Thank you all for being here. And as I mentioned in the beginning, you are all invited to stay for lunch as well as continued conversation. So please start heading out towards where the lunch is. Thank you.
Nathan, just one thing, Nathan. You know, on Lord, I Need You. On the verse 2, can you help harmonize, like on the second, third verse, like where you are, Lord, I am free, right? That part, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ. 所以会听起来像这样子 ，OK？ Where sins runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Right? Holiness is Christ in me. Right? So like, okay, and where you are, okay? Come here, come with the microphone, okay? I want you with me, okay? And where you are, Lord, I am where you are, Lord. Okay? Where you are, okay? 1, 2, 3. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Yeah. Holiness is Christ in me. It's Christ in me, right? Christ. Holiness is Christ in me. Okay, now I want you to come out a little more, okay? The Lord, I am free, that is the statement, okay? It's a statement there. Where sins run deep, Christ in me, right? Christ in me, Christ in me.
Holiness is Christ in me, Christ in me,
The Christ in me, okay?
Christ in me.
Hello? Hello? It's okay, we'll be up, thank you. Good job, Sue. Okay, thank you. Stronger. Where you are, okay? Because I want to sing along. Okay? And where you are, stronger. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Christ in me, Christ in me, Christ in me. Okay. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. From the first note, you gotta hit it.
Okay.
Christ in me, not me. Like Christ in me. Okay. One more time, okay. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Yeah. Yeah. That's better, okay? I just need you to give me, because that give me an extra strength drive, okay? Good. All right. You okay? Yeah, the only thing I noticed, just lower nature is more like small fill in, right? It's just more the goodness of